Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely profound question. What is American identity? To figure that out, we're actually going to crash the cutting-edge insights of modern sociology right into the sweeping timeline of ancient history. We'll be blending research from Tufts University political scientist Deborah J. Schildkraut with a comprehensive look at the deep, fascinating history of the land that eventually became the United States. It's a huge question, isn't it? What does it actually mean to be American? I mean, you hear this debated on the news constantly, you read about it in history books, and, you've probably talked about it with your own friends and family. So I want to pose this big question to you right off the bat. Keep it in the back of your mind as we go through this. How exactly do we measure national identity, especially in an era that's as complex and multicultural as ours? Can we even boil it down to just one thing? Well, here's our roadmap for today to help us unpack all of this. First, defining American identity today. Second, the first inhabitants. Third, complex indigenous societies. Fourth, European colonization. And finally, number 5, the multiple traditions theory. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Defining American Identity Today. Deborah J. Schildkraut's sociological question. Stepping into the 21st century, political scientist Deborah J. Schildkraut set out to test a really fascinating idea. Doesn't an increasingly multicultural America actually change our core norms? Well, her crucial finding gave us the multiple traditions theory. Basically, this theory argues that American identity is absolutely not some solid, single monolith. Instead, her research confirms that being American is defined by a really broad, complex, and honestly, sometimes contradictory set of norms. Because of all these competing ideas, it's virtually impossible to reduce Americanism down to one simple measure. It's more like a deeply layered tapestry. But to truly grasp why our modern identity is so layered, we have to figure out where those layers actually came from in the first place. Which brings us to Section 2, the first inhabitants, tracing the deep roots. Let's zoom way back in time to get some perspective here. We're talking roughly 30,000 years ago, when Paleoindians first crossed the Beringia land bridge into this totally frozen world. Fast forward to 10,000 BCE, as the Ice Age was finally waning, and human populations were already well established all across North America. Around 9100 BCE, we see these incredibly resilient early Americans adapt, forming the Clovis culture. They're actually identifiable by these very distinct fluted spear points they used to hunt massive, literally giant Ice Age megafauna like mammoths. But as those huge animals eventually went extinct, human societies had to pivot again. So by 8000 BCE, we witnessed this monumental shift from foraging to agriculture. The very first farming begins down in central Mexico, and that's a real game changer that would eventually spread northward and completely transform the continent. Moving right along to Section 3, complex indigenous societies, cities, confederacies, and kingdoms. Now, take a second and think about the number 20,000. That was the estimated population of the Mississippian city of Cahokia at its absolute peak in the 12th century. Located near modern-day St. Louis, Missouri, this was a bustling metropolis centered right around a massive 100-foot-tall earthwork known as Monk's Mound. Just to put that into perspective for you, Cahokia actually had a larger population than London did at that exact same time. And this beautifully illustrates the staggering cultural contrast you see just within indigenous populations themselves. If you look at the Pacific Northwest, you find highly affluent societies relying heavily on salmon. It was a vital resource and a spiritual symbol, and they'd celebrate their wealth through these incredibly elaborate gift-giving feasts called potlatches. But if you travel down to the Southwest, you'll find the Anasazi culture doing something entirely different. They were constructing massive stone and adobe pueblos, basically these intricate apartment-like structures built right into sheer cliff faces, like the famous Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde. Literally 2 entirely different ways of life sharing the very same continent. We also see some seriously deep political complexity thriving during this time. Up in what is now upstate New York, long before the U.S. Constitution was even a glimmer of an idea, 5 distinct tribes actually united in the mid-15th century. They formed the highly powerful Iroquois Confederacy. This brought together the Oneida, Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca tribes. Governed by a representative group of 50 Sachem chiefs, this was a highly organized political machine. They expertly managed diplomacy and aggressively expanded their territory, using warfare to push smaller neighboring tribes further westward. Now, if we look beyond the mainland, the Hawaiian civilization spent roughly 6 centuries developing a really rich, entirely unique culture in total isolation. Following their first likely settlements around 940 CE and then later Tahitian arrivals by 1200, they flourished completely independently. But, as you might guess, that trajectory shifted drastically in 1778 when British explorer James Cook arrived. Shortly after that contact, by leveraging newly introduced European military technology, Kamehameha I unified what had historically been separate islands into a single cohesive Hawaiian kingdom by 1795. Similarly, down in the Caribbean, the island of Puerto Rico has this incredibly deep local history. By the year 1000, Arawak settlers had arrived and eventually evolved into the Taino people. By the time of European contact, they had built a thriving society of up to 60,000 individuals, centrally led by a single chief known as a cacique. Tragically, though, the subsequent colonization brought the harsh Spanish encomienda system, along with devastating Old World epidemics, which led to the near-total decimation of their local population. That brings us to Section 4, the European colonization, overlapping arrivals 1075 to 1754. The colonial map of North America was fragmented and multicultural from the very start. For instance, the Norse explored Vinland centuries before the British even founded their first permanent settlement in Jamestown in 1607, which was then followed closely by the Mayflower landing in Plymouth in 1620. And meanwhile, throughout the 17th century, the Dutch were super active settling the mid-Atlantic with New Netherland. That actually acted as a barrier to British expansion until the British finally seized it in 1664. So you have all these multiple European powers suddenly staking claims side by side with nations of indigenous peoples who had been there for centuries. But we have to remember, this wasn't just a cultural exchange. It was a massive biological one. Europeans introduced horses, cattle, and hogs to the Americas. In return, they took things like maize, turkeys, tomatoes, potatoes, and tobacco back across the ocean to Europe. However, we absolutely have to note the much darker side of this exchange. The Europeans also brought over Eurasian diseases, like smallpox and measles. And because Native American populations had zero natural immunity to these specific illnesses, they suffered massive epidemics. This completely devastated their populations and fundamentally disrupted their societies long before large-scale European settlement fully took hold. Let's bring this all together in Section 5, the multiple traditions theory, synthesizing the past and present. Okay, let's zoom back into the present day and look at Deborah J. Schildkraut's exact conclusion from her sociological study. She writes, the results further show that most Americans, regardless of their ethnic or immigrant background, share this complex view of the norms that constitute American identity. Think about how powerful that actually is. Despite, or honestly, maybe entirely because of, this chaotic, diverse, and overlapping history that spans tens of thousands of years, modern Americans actually embrace a multi-creedal reality. We intuitively understand that identity is made up of multiple and, yeah, sometimes contradictory, traditions. So, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. How does knowing this deep, contradictory history shape your own view of what it means to be American today? When you look past the simple definitions and actually see the 30,000 years of migrations, the rise of massive indigenous cities, the overlapping European arrivals, and those world-changing cultural exchanges, it completely transforms how we view ourselves today, doesn't it? The tapestry is so much richer and way more complex than we usually give it credit for. Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer today. I really hope this sparked your curiosity, and I highly encourage you to keep exploring this fascinating history on your own.